Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today is a tag that I've been meaning to do for like about a month, which is the Mid-Year Freakout Tag. And I realise we're getting closer and closer to being pretty far from mid-year, but let's go with it. I haven't done a tag for a good while, but at the top of this, I'm just going to say tag, tag yourself if you want to do this and want to take part. I think many people already have, so I'm kind of reluctant to tag, particularly as by the time people then see it and maybe do their own, we may be in August, and that suddenly feels quite far. Anyway, but let's get on with the tag itself. The first one here is the best book you've read so far this year. And I'm sort of looking back, the book that keeps on singing out to me as being probably one of the best books I've read this year has to be Stillborn by Guadalupe Nattel, translated by Rosalind Harvey. And I was just so blown away by this from sort of the first few pages, really. The way the voice of this book is constructed, the way it points towards this, all kind of goes in the direction of this incredible story that has a lot of important things at its heart around motherhood and around choices around motherhood, is all so profound. But also at the same time, I think the thing I said in the review at the time was it would be so easy for the characters to become sort of ciphers for political opinions, right? To kind of have character A who wants kids, character B who doesn't, and for them to be fairly fixed in what they do. I think actually the real strength of this book is the fact that the characters aren't stuck in those. The character who doesn't want kids ends up having some kind of motherly relationship to sort of another kid in her life, and has these pigeons living on her balcony who she watches. And the person who does want kids and has a kid also goes through some really complicated thoughts around childhood as well that are very different. So I think that's what I found just so deeply profound about this. And actually there's a prompt later that is about a new to you favorite author, and I think Guadalupe Nattel is one who I'm going to be keeping a really strong eye on, just because I adored this. I read another book of hers which I've now completely forgotten the name of. I'll put it in the little blurb bit, but I was just really blown away by how she writes, and so I think it would have to be her as well. The next prompt is the best book from a sequel that you've read this year. And I was looking back through, and I don't think I've read any sequels apart from this one that I will kind of claim as part of this. So Eva Baltazar, translated by Julia Sanchez, has written both Permafrost and Boulder being shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. And Boulder is a book that I absolutely adored. And technically it's the second as part of a triptych, so I'm going to claim it. I'm also really excited to actually finally read Permafrost and sort of read the first in the triptych. And again, they're a triptych, they're not necessarily sequels to each other, but I will take that as part of it for this prompt, because otherwise it's, pulling at straws. Like, I listened to a podcast about the Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman. That's otherwise as close as I'm having to get with this. But yeah, Boulder by Eva Baltazar, and I'm now really excited to read Permafrost as well, translated both by Julia Sanchez. Next up is new release that you haven't read yet but want to, and there are two that really come to mind for this. I'm sort of cheating by just choosing however many books for each of these prompts that I want, but because it's our channel. And whatever. But the two that really come to mind are firstly Berta de Villa, The Dear Ones, published by 3 Times Rebel Press, and this is, I believe, their 5th book so far. They have just been really churning out some incredible books since they started last year, and so I'm really keen to finally read this, translated by I will find the translate. Oh, sorry, translated by Jacob Rogers. It's on the front cover, Bob. You should be able to read that. But yeah, really excited for this, just because 3 Times Rebel, I think, have just been incredibly strong, like right out the gate with their choices of books. So really excited to read this one. And the other one is Man-Eating Typewriter by Richard Millwood, which is a bit of a chunky book. It's about sort of 500 pages or so, but it is a really experimental book anyhow, but it's mostly written in Polari, which is a sort of language dialect, kind of sits on some kind of place in the continuum there. but was sort of a language that was often used by LGBTQ plus people, particularly queer men, kind of a good sort of 50, 60, 70 years ago, and a bit before as well, as a sort of hidden code language. And it was a way of not being detected, of being able to sort of see somebody and be able to say like, like recognizes like here, and kind of go from there. So I think that's probably what I'd say. I'm really, really excited to finally read this. I kind of almost hope that it's on the book along list, not only because it sounds like my kind of book itself anyway, but also because then it kind of like is an added little push for me to read this. But I will at some point in the year read this book anyway. Next up is the most anticipated release for the second half of the year. And I keep on getting really confused with a lot of dates coming out for things, because I'll apply for lots of things on NetGalley and then I'll get them and then I'll start reading them and then realise they're not actually out yet, or I'll see them in a bookshop and be like, right, they are actually out now. But I will say that even though I actually do technically have an advanced copy of it, the one I'm most looking forward to and actually reading is the new book by Zadie Smith. I'm still a little bit behind on reading a lot of her stuff. I think I've read maybe 3 of her books, but really enjoyed what she does with writing, particularly on beauty, which I just adored and thought was a stunning book. So her new book, I think, will be an incredibly exciting one. It sounds like quite an interesting way of using historical fiction to sort of probe into some sort of quite modern day concepts as well. So really, really interested for that. And I just think sort of Zadie Smith, the really interesting thing I kind of find is from interviews and things I've seen, or articles particularly about her, she doesn't often give interviews. She is sort of mostly off the internet as much as possible. She doesn't have a mobile, at least one that sort of is connected to sort of social media and things. So Zadie Smith sort of almost does that sort of Beyonce album release thing of kind of like, oh yeah, there's a new book coming, and there's no, like the fanfare is all coming from her publisher, and that's, I think, quite exciting. So I'm really looking forward to reading the new Zadie Smith book. The next one is Biggest Disappointment, and I don't really like sort of, I don't know, crapping on books that I will just say, the Booker short, the International Booker shortlist. I realise fair few books have been from that so far, but the Maurice Condé book on that list I really struggled with, and I think it was really strange for me because I loved the first 40 pages, and I was really excited to just kind of get into the rest of the book and go from there, and I just really couldn't get into it anymore, which was really quite frustrating, but it happens. But on a lighter note, the next prompt is around your biggest surprise, and I think a book that surprised me positively was Martin McInnes's In Ascension, which I, going into, thought sounded kind of interesting, but kind of thought might not be my thing as such. I mean, actually no, a fair bit of it I thought could be quite interesting, but I didn't really know what to expect. And instead I found myself really getting swept along in this beautiful narrative that was so poignant and clever, and at times just really went to some deep, dark, emotional places, but also had this real sort of florid beauty in the language at times. So yeah, just a really interesting surprise as well. So that was a nice, positive sort of version of that as well. I'm going to take prompts 8 and 9 together, which is sort of newest fictional crush and newest favorite character. And I don't know, fictional crushes don't really happen for me, partly because I also think I read a fair few books that are quite either depressing or where, I don't know, lots of things are happening where I'm like, none of these characters are everyone's quite morally grey, and not like they have to not be to be attractive or whatever. But yeah, you know what I mean. It's sort of, I don't know, I guess I'm not necessarily reading for that. But the two that I'll combine for this question, I think in some ways will be the characters in The New Life by Tom Crew. And the book, I think, so crush is maybe stretching it, but there are quite a few scenes in the book that are quite sexy and quite hot. And I think generally Tom Crew has also just rewritten, I think, sex between men in this really powerful way. Kind of like actually sort of towards the end of last year when I read Sam Kenyon's book as well, that sort of dealt with that really beautifully. I think Tom Crew equally does that really clever thing of, he writes about sex in a really powerful and vulnerable and beautiful way. And at times it's messy and it's whatever, but equally it's sort of, it's there as a part of an important plot point, or it's character development in some way as well. It's not just kind of, there's nothing wrong with it just being for people to get their rocks off, but like it feels like it has a really powerful presence in the book. And so actually I think both sort of fictional crush and favorite characters would come from that, because I think there's a real nuance to the way characters are able to exist in that book, that is really quite beautiful and profound, and quite an attractive quality about the characters, I think, as well. So let's go for that, even though the characters themselves maybe are, I don't know, a bit trickier in various other ways. The next prompt is books that made you cry, or a book that made you cry. And I don't really cry at books that often. I think it's maybe happened twice in my life, maybe twice, yeah. But I will say the one that was probably closest this year was Peter App's book about Grenfell, Show Me the Bodies. And so, sort of very brief thing, Grenfell Tower was a council block, sort of set of houses, sort of set of flats in the UK, in London. And it was an area where traditionally sort of lower income, traditionally a lower income area, and essentially the tower block had been left kind of to rot in many ways. Lots of safety protocols were overlooked, lots of potential bits of investment were overlooked, complaints were overlooked. All of these things happened, and in Peter Apps's book he really goes into the nuts and bolts of the many ways that the people of Grenfell were failed. And what that ultimately led to was just this complete evisceration of that tower block when a fire happened. Many people lost their lives. Many people, just even if they did survive, were incredibly traumatized, were often not moved to new housing for a really long time. And so Peter Apps's book is just such a profound and important book about that tragedy. And I think for me, the real power of the book was in being able to sort of line by line just really talk about all of the injustices and failures that happened in the lead up to it. And I didn't cry as such, but towards the end of the book, particularly in the audiobook, the author, the narrator, reads out the names of every single person who lost their lives during the Grenfell Tower disaster. And there is something really quite just, it kind of just knocks you off your feet. It just is really quite profound to sit and listen to somebody read out the names of the dead, and their family's still looking for justice, and sometimes just hear the same surname coming up several times, so sort of a whole family potentially lost their lives. It's incredibly difficult, but really important reading, I think, as well. I just think it's still such a tragedy, and I think the book does such a great job of talking about those injustices, but also really honouring the stories of the people who didn't make it, or even the people who did make it but are living completely altered lives as a result. So that got a bit heavy, but the next prompt is a book that made you happy, and I'm going to go with Paul Baker's Camp, which is a history of camp as a sort of concept, and kind of what that's looked like in popular culture. And I love Paul Baker's writing anyway. He writes a lot about Polari, and sort of that's, makes me think of, man-eating typewriter. But he, in this book about camp, just references so many sort of movie stars and pop icons and TV shows and everything, many of which I, as sort of a Brit growing up in a very certain era, know very, very well. And some of these I don't know as well. It's kind of interesting to see them. But there are so many funny moments in this book of just sort of how raucous and fun and silly this book is, in talking about some of this ridiculous moments, but actually at the heart of it, this book has a real political core of there is a reason that these these things, as frivolous and as silly as they may seem, and as camp can sometimes seem like this incredibly frivolous trivial thing, actually at the heart of it there's something really quite profound, because it's a challenging of sort of rules around them, and it can be used as a form of protest. And I just think it's so brilliant to see a book like this as well. So I mean, I loved it, and it also made me incredibly happy as a result. Next up is the most beautiful book you've acquired this year. And I'd probably say Linda Grant's The Story of the Forest. And I realise I keep talking about this book, but I mean, apart from how much I just loved the story of this book itself, this cover, may I direct your eyes to this cover? I just think it's this really beautiful, not only set of colours, where I did actually pretty much buy the book because of the cover, well, partly because of the cover, but also I just sort of thought that the way this front cover actually really quite well for me maps onto what the book's actually about, in terms of there are these sort of murkier colours of sort of shades of what's happening in the story, but then there are also these real vibrant colours of this sort of theatrical actor kind of figure who is quite prominent in the book. And I really loved this book on so many levels, but this cover, if nothing else as well, is gorgeous. The next prompt is all about books you need to read by the end of the year. And as much as I realise I'm probably the worst person to be saying this, because I often force myself to slog through various books for whatever reason, I'm also trying to take the approach of not having to read certain books, apart from when I need to give them back to the library. But largely, I follow quite a lot of prize lists, and I also just will have these big grand plans in my mind of things that I need to read this year and as part of a certain timeline. I'm trying to avoid that where possible, although having said that, I would, by the end of this year, really like to have read all of the Booker winners. I think I may be 13 or something, 13, 14 away. And I'd quite like to read those. So I will be reading The Luminaries, which is somewhere down here. Here we go. The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton, at some point this year. I recently read Burnham Wood, which I really loved, so I think I will eventually get around to this. But then I've kind of got this other pile of things that I've sort of been really wanting to read. A couple of them I sort of have to for various reasons, so again, have to. But I mean, with this one I've made a commitment, so probably should, which is Take My Hand by Dolen Perkins Valdez, and Horse by Geraldine Brooks, for the BookTube prize. And I've got a couple of weeks where I probably need to be reading those, and then a couple of others where I set myself the Eurovision reading challenge, of reading a book from the country, one book at least from the top 10 Eurovision, the top 10 of Eurovision this year, the top 10 finishing countries, a book from each of their countries. I overcomplicated that description massively, but I've got a few that have arrived from the library, so I will also have to get these back sometime soon. So Memoirs of Hadrian by Margaret Yourcenar, Salma Lagerlöf's The Saga of Gösta Berling, and Queer Ukraine, sort of a collection of fragments of writing, short stories, poems, all those sorts of things, essays, from LGBTQ plus Ukrainians, and sort of translated as well. So those are things I will sort of be really, really wanting to read. Also one that I have to read soon for a book club. I say have to. Again, this is actually a really big pleasure, because I've been wanting to read this. Love Leader by Mark Hyatt as well. So really, really looking forward to a lot of those. I realise that's a lot of books, but there you go. But those will be some of the ones I'm planning on reading. And all that really remains is sort of to tag. And again, I didn't really want to tag just because of people. It's kind of been and gone in some ways with this, but it does also mention about sort of shouting out booktubers who you think have been doing really, really interesting things. And sort of two people I just really wanted to sort of shout out: Anne Novella, firstly, just because she's great and I always get really good book recommendations from her, and also she's been doing this really interesting reading project across the year as well, and I'll also tag her co-conspirator in that as well. But Another person I really want to shout out is Ben Reed's Good, who was a really big part in me picking up, well, I already had a copy of it, but coming around to actually finally reading it, Rian Bell by Priya Hain. So Ben Reed's Good was just sort of wonderfully sort of almost evangelical about this book, and I entirely see why. I read it, I loved it, I think it's an incredibly powerful book. So Ben Reed's Good, who I will tag at some place below the screen. But yeah, anyway, I hope you're doing really, really well, and are having a good week so far. I realise we are way beyond the mid-year in some ways, but also, there we go. Time is a construct or something. Anyway, take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.